Welcome to The Rippling Pages, a podcast on the craft of writing, crafted and curated by me, Liam Bishop. Today, we're talking about clay, its vast and seemingly infinite history, whether it's the venerated bowls for the Japanese tea ceremony, clay's religious symbolism in the book of Genesis, or the potential evidence of clay being on Mars. These are some of the many encounters that my guest, Jennifer Lucy Allan, has with clay in her new book, Clay, A Human History, published by White Rabbit Books. In Jennifer's previous book, The Foghorn's Lament, Jennifer demonstrated a seemingly boundless inquisitiveness for her subject and the world. That book was an elegy for the art and industry of the foghorn. She's also written for The Guardian, Quietus, and The Wire, and you might already be familiar with her voice. She's a presenter on BBC Radio 3's Late Junction. Jennifer, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We'll get straight into it. And I've given us a bit of a hint there, but let's, tell us a bit about this story of clay and some of the places that it takes you in this book.
While I was writing the book about foghorns and doing the research for that, which was a PhD before the book, I was in Southend and I needed something to do that wasn't thinking. And, I was using so much brain power and I needed something to do that sort of took me out of my own head. I needed something practical, and I had walked past this pottery shop and popped in and said, "Oh, do you know anyone that does classes? That sounds good." And he said, "No, I don't. But if you go down there, you find Madeline, she might let you in." And so, and this is in Leigh-on-Sea, and I had to sort of walk to this marina and then through these gates and past all of these shipping containers and find the right one. And inside this shipping container, in the middle of this marina, that's like a working marina, people live there, but there's fishing boats, all sorts going on, was somebody who was running open studio classes. And you open the door and you can't believe it's even there. As I usually do, I became completely entranced by this material. I'd never had the opportunity to touch clay or work with it at school. My school didn't have any art resources at all, so never did anything with it, never had classes as a kid, anything like that. So I was coming to it totally fresh in my 20s and was just completely overawed by it. But then, as I usually do when I really get excited by something, I went out looking for books on it. Where's the books? Where's the stories? And I was really surprised to find that while there's quite a lot of amazing writing on ceramic histories, there's a load of amazing instructional books. There hadn't been this book that was in that kind of vein of new, exciting nonfiction that takes advantages of all the research tools that are available to us now. I sort of came to realize this was it is still a sensory history. It's about objects and people and the way we perceive things, the way we preserve things. And you pretty quickly realize that if you ever wanted to write about this material, a chronology is just impossible. Trying to sort of center it around certain objects to be able to tell a story just was not making me very excited. So I kind of pulled back because I am interested in how things connect and also how they connect to our imaginations as human, what thinking about something in a different way allows you to think about the rest of the world. Really interested in, my perfect sort of story or anecdote or research is a micro history that has something profound in it that really can re-enchant the world for you when you hear about it.
I'll tell you what I love about that. I love that your first encounter was, well, not first encounter, but one of the initial, and this is an initial encounter in the book as well, is of going to this class in Southend. And it's as if this image of you walking into this container and this world sort of opening up to you.
Totally. I mean, it really did. I cannot explain to you, it really did. And I think that was enhanced by my sort of mental state at the time, because I was doing all this writing, reading quite a lot of heavy theory and philosophy, and to have something. And I think a lot of people find this when they first go to pottery classes. When you go to a pottery class, you can't touch your phone and you don't have to think about things or look at a screen. And that's so liberating in lots of ways.
I can see why it took 8 years to write, because you literally take us from the dawn of sort of human history, because that's where clay is, to life on Mars. And you've talked about being captivated. What was that kind of trigger? I don't know if you can remember when you first set hands on the clay or first got stuck into that process. When did you realize that this is a journey that's gonna take a long time, kind of thing?
The book didn't really emerge until much later. you know, after the Foghorn book, where I was like, what's the next one? But the idea for the clay book didn't really materialize till that was finished. So actually the main part of the research happened in like the space of about 2 years. The research and writing, like I don't really separate the two. I don't do research and then write. I do it all at the same time in some sort of chaotic, you know, impulse driven, what am I interested in, where am I going sort of sense.
Well, you can see that though. You can see that in the book because you are, in some cases, it is you in primary, material, and some of it's secondary material. It's what you read and kind of what you find in archives and that kind of thing. So you can see that it is, as much as it is a non-fiction book about clay, it is also this personal journey or voyage into clay and its history.
Yeah, I wanted to, I think a lot about what sort of book is this? Like, how does it appear to the reader? I thought a lot about that with the Foghorn, and I was like, this does not need to be a long book, the Foghorn book. This is about foghorns. It's good if it feels like a foghorn blast, like there's a bit of immediacy and rhythm in it somehow. Like, so it's a hot, this like blast of stuff where you're just like, what? And then that's it. Like, it does not need to be 500 pages. And with this, I was sort of thinking about the same thing. And what originally seemed to be a limiting factor actually, for as a writer, turned into like the main sort of shaper of the book in terms of how I was writing, who I was writing it, because that's really important, I guess. Leaning into the moments where there was something obscure or esoteric or unknown was really important to me, to like trust my instincts in terms of what I was interested in and to let that shape the choice of kind of people or places or objects that I was talking about. And there are times when I'm talking about, legendary people who are like some of the best known potters to have lived in the last few hundred years, like Lodi Kwali and Maria Martinez. And I found myself sort of thinking, oh, maybe I should find somebody lesser known. But actually within their histories as potters, there was really important things to say about the way we have preserved histories of craftspeople or the techniques that they use. So there was usually that questioning of like, I'm really interested in this. And then to be sort of sit back and be like, yeah, but why are you interested? What is going on here that makes you interested in it? And then the process of drawing that out and thinking about it and reading around it is then kind of how I talk to the reader, I guess. That sense of discovery and curiosity.
I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that, just the difference between writing about, and you hinted, well, you spoke about it there, actually. Really interesting how you said you tried to create a book that was like a foghorn blast and a book that's sort of like, clay. And what I find quite interesting is that one is the foghorn seems a lot more ephemeral. And it's kind of like your relationship to time as well, to some extent. And the ephemerality of the foghorn compared to something that seems so enduring and permanent as clay, we find it everywhere. We find evidence of not only clay, but the produce of clay everywhere. Because you write so much about your experience with these materials, how much did your perception of perhaps the world change in writing these books, if that makes sense? Or what was your experience of writing these books and how were they different?
They're actually like incredibly different in terms of the process, the actual writing process, the research process that went into them. So the Foghorn book was the first book, and it had 4 years of PhD research behind it, So that did involve a lot of visits to places, a lot of archives, but also a lot of sites. I did interviews for that because I was dealing with something where there was very little existing primary research in any obvious sense. So I kind of was doing a lot of that primary research or compiling some of those histories or trying to piece them together. And I was in a really excellent sound studies department with some of like the best kind of current writers on kind of sonic theory and field recording and things like that in that department. And so I was really immersed in an environment of thinking about the way we listen and what does it mean to listen in certain ways. How do we characterize our listening, which is so ephemeral? Whereas with the clay book, I'd done a lot of clay making, but that is a lifetime's mastering of a craft, and you can spend a lifetime and still only get good at one technique, and there's so many techniques, you know. So and also it did have some of the same challenges as the Foghorn book, in terms of you're talking about knowledge that is not necessarily verbal. You're talking about muscle memory, techniques, like the way very particular amounts of pressures on the palms or fingertips. So that it did pose a similar challenge in that way, the ephemerality of sound, and then the fact that lots of the stuff I was talking about in terms of making techniques were also not necessarily verbal, or easy to write down or describe. And I like that challenge as a writer, and I kind of talk about it in the book. There were challenges in terms of, yeah, like you said, the ephemerality of foghorns, and then the kind of solidity of clay. Because I've been a music writer, you know, sound writer, whatever you want to call it, for a long time, I actually, you know, I have so many strategies that I can't really articulate for how I will describe a sound. Like, I can hear 10 seconds of sound and I can write 500 words, no problem. Like, whatever it is, like, I can do that. But then when I was faced with, early on, when I was sort of thinking, well, here's a green dinner plate. And I'm like, okay, so what are you going to say? It's a green dinner plate. And I was just sort of, I didn't have the same strategies for writing about color and shape and things like that. So
Listeners come to this podcast for, you know, insights on craft, and that's a really kind of interesting way of putting it, how you had to change your strategy for writing about this topic and this subject. So it's really interesting and nice to hear that. And it's funny because some of the, you know, some of the language that we use is very tactile. You spoke then about sort of pulling it apart, and I think there's quite this sort of ironic detachment throughout the book about how you write about it, and that you've sort of hinted towards there, and how we get to grips with, again, there I've done it there, you know, get to grips with the subject. We're molding it, we're gripping it all the time.
Yeah.
Is it something that's uniquely human? Is this something that could only existed, do you think? I know clay exists, but is it, you know, is it about the raw material itself, or is it more about what we do with it that enchants you?
Well, I guess the material has its own histories, whether we exist or not. But our ability to understand them, to record them, to think about them, to write about them, to sort of make them, I guess, in a literal sense of like objects, material histories. You need humans to have the enchantment, I guess.
You know, is there a world where we don't start molding and taking it out of the earth and start doing things with it? Is
Well,
it enduring in that respect?
you know, I thought, oh, somewhere in the introduction that you're going to mention some of these creation stories like Genesis, the Golem, things like that. But then when you go looking, there's a huge amount more. Like, and it's not completely cross-cultural, but you can find it in a huge cross section of sort of belief systems in major world religions, but also like sort of small tribes in various parts of South America. Like, that's something where I enjoyed not being a formal academic, I guess, because that to me is like, just all of those stories become this fuel for the imagination in the way that we can think about this material if we want. You know, you don't have to say anything solid about it, but look at all these stories, and then what does that allow us to think about this material? There is an alternative of this book. You know, there's so many different versions of this book that could have been written.
We're going to have a quick break now on the Rippling Pages, but do come back because we're going to hear lots more about this wonderful world and history of clay. If you're enjoying today's episode, why not leave a review on your favorite podcast provider? I know I ask this every time, but doing so just lets me know that you are enjoying it, but also it can boost the ratings of the show, which in turn boosts the coverage of these fantastic books like Jennifer's that we have on the podcast. From Cowboys last time to Clay this time, the Rippling Pages is boundless. So do join us for the second half, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for coming back, Jennifer. We'll get back into it. I want to talk about Marija Gimbutas. I found her an incredibly interesting person, but I think it did sort of tie into these questions about, you know, how we write about histories, or how clay sort of ties into what we tell ourselves about our history. I just wondered if you could tell us about who she is and sort of what she did with clay.
She was Lithuanian and she started out studying folklore. And then she, via Germany, went over to the States. Very few female lecturers at Harvard. And then but it was still quite stuffy and restrictive for women. Like she couldn't go in some of the libraries. So she moved over to UCLA, which had a very sort of, a much more sort of progressive, open-minded department at the time. Started bringing in ideas around the sort of folklore and mythology that she had studied back in Lithuania. Basically, what this led to was her studying a period in, I think, Neolithic history, and she identified this area as Old Europe. And basically, it was kind of roughly contemporary with early, what we call like civilization and cities. I say that in inverted commas because those are all debatable terms. But they seem to like live in harmony with the earth and seem to very sort of equal societies in terms of people's place in them. But also what proliferated in the ceramic artifacts from there were these goddess figurines. And basically she sort of studied this area and did a huge amount of research and went round to a lot of the local, museums and stores and things, taking photographs of all of these things for, I think, 10 years or something. And then she built up basically an entire pantheon around what she'd seen and all the things she'd studied about this area. So she wrote a book called The Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe, which was later changed to The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe because there's very few sort of male figurine, like obviously male figurines. But within that, she was building a pantheon. So there's like the language around what she was using was like, this is the snake goddess and this is what the snake goddess does. But there was obviously no writing, no sort of legible written evidence for what these could possibly be. Like it was all material evidence gathered through archaeology, but she was kind of applying what she knew about folklore because she held that some folklore practices might hold a link all the way back to these Neolithic peoples. But when she published that book, and she went on to publish quite a few more about this sort of society, she was basically denounced or sort of very heavily criticized by a lot of people in her profession because she'd applied her imagination, she'd applied this kind of ideas of folklore and mythology to kind of interpret these. And she'd sort of built up these incredibly, like they're very seductive, like poetic descriptions of these different goddesses that exist in this certain way in the world, and then their symbols are on the pots and all this. But basically this society, which had been kind of brutally, I think almost wiped out by invading herders who were kind of nomadic and were on horses and had forged weapons. And so it seems like this society was wiped out. And a lot of the debate around the time was about whether this was a brutal, violent incursion or whether it was about the spread of agriculture sort of taking over. And DNA evidence has since posthumously proved her sort of brutal incursion to be right. And it's really important for many reasons, the invasion of the Kurgan, because it's about the spread of the Indo-European language, which is, a huge proportion of languages spoken across the world have their root in the Indo-European language. But it also kind of tapped into sort of burgeoning like feminist movement, new age, earth-centered movements at the time. So she was kind of then co-opted as very much like this expert and hero for those movements. And because what she was saying about, women, she was sort of undermining the idea that patriarchy is, a natural and a given, and that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah, wow. It's a great summary, but
yeah, and then I had to, so all of that basically, then I had to sort of summarize that in about 5 pages. But she did become in terms of the way we think about her professional lineage, gives us this lens to think about how archaeologists talk about things, how they expect things to be written, how they expect histories to be understood, and then how like an entirely different group of people can then think about something in an entirely different way. And that is a lot about the human history. Like that's the same information and it's happening in different ways, and it means different things to different people. Like, her research kind of poses this incredible question, which I think is quite, has a, like, often reflects back on us a lot, which is about, you know, what is the structure of society now? What is changeable about it? What and what is not? What do we assume is permanent, and what could be otherwise? And her clay figurines allow us to do that.
100%, yeah, 100%, and that's what I found really interesting. It really made me think about how we tell. So obviously, there's a lot in here about history and history of clay, but this felt like it was about how we tell histories. It was, well, it seems like it was a feminist critique to some extent, whether how polemic that was, but it's how people are written about, and how people are written about, the forms that, you know, the form of them, what they look like. I thought it was just a really kind of side narrative here about
Yeah.
how people are written about and how we write about different forms, I guess.
Yeah, and how you take for granted a lot of your language, like that. I found that really interesting as a writer, you know, especially when I was coming to edit things. It's our imagination that works out all of those possibilities, but we'll never ever have the answer. And as a writer, like, that sort of openness in terms of the possibilities is just really exciting.
You know, kind of the role of you've spoken a lot about the role of language and kind of being a writer, but perhaps how language sort of, depending on how it's used and who uses it, it keeps things in a you know, how do we preserve things? How do we preserve the culture of things? Is it about preservation, or is it about kind of bringing it into the modern day? You know, what's its context? You know, where does it sit? And, you know, I think about a museum where you put, you know, you could put an object in a museum, but then you would write about the object. So how do you? It feels like you in the book, you know, sort of saying things about how we bring things out from the past and hold them up in the present day as objects, and give them a context.
Well, there's that thing which I guess one of the main frustrations when writing the book was how much I could not touch things. And that sounds a bit wrong, but you know, so many ceramic artifacts are in vitrines. And one of the things that when you start doing pottery is like a real sort of test of an object or a maker's skill is, if somebody's made a mug, you pick it up and you see how heavy it is. Like, if it's very heavy, that means, like, that's not thought to be as skillful as a very light one. Like, it's very hard to get things very light. So, and that's another value system. But without being able to pick up an object, like, you can't, well, firstly, you can't really understand how it's been made without, for example, taking a bowl and lifting it up to see what's on the bottom. And secondly, you can't weigh it, you can't feel the surface. So there was this constant frustration at not being able to touch anything, actually, because I was feeling like I couldn't understand these objects. They're all separated from me. And the moments when I could touch the objects, like or handle them in some way, the Crafts Study Centre in Farnham, which has a huge archive of pottery by most of the like best known studio potters of the 20th century. They do allow you to get pots out, and you put them on the desk and you can touch them and lift them up, and you know somebody's with you, but they're objects that where you can touch a surface. Is that smooth or satin, or what's going on here?
Yeah, I want to talk about the actual process of, you know, making clay and making pots and putting it in a kiln and that kind of thing. But kind of it shocks me really thinking about how much of it we have, you know, how much of it has been, just use that word again, preserved, because it's so fragile once it is made. You know, all you have to do is drop it, smash it into, you know, 100 pieces or whatever. So it's astonishing that we have so much to sort of go off, and even the stuff that has been smashed, and, you know, we can find stuff in the earth, can't we, that relates to you know, it could be a piece of something, and which always seems to be the news story, doesn't it? You know, they've found, you know,
Yeah.
remnants of a remnants of a, you
Well,
know.
the climate change is playing into that. So, you
Okay.
know, in lots of areas, changing climates are revealing things in the landscape that were previously hidden. So, you know, more perma ice melts, the more stuff we're going to have. The
Right.
more, yeah,
Podcast
like
for.
I don't think that counts for me. That's not a silver lining, but like for example, changing sea levels and differing at more extreme sea levels means that there are, coastal caves where there may have been very, very early human activity that then become known or accessible again. So there's that, and that means that this leads into one of the things that I was really surprised by when I started doing a lot of the research in the book and asking questions of, I talked to a couple of archaeologists, was how much a lot of this extremely ancient history is a hot topic again. Those debates are not sewn up and those debates are not finished. And actually, there's a lot of new stuff happening.
Yeah, and I do find that super interesting. I find that I'm really interested in sort of psychology and sort of psychoanalysis to some extent. And as you speak, it just makes me think about, how that thing about uncovering histories, that we're sort of either repressed, cancelled, shut away, just forgotten. And it's this, what happens when we find something that makes us, rethink who we are as people or society or as a culture. It's quite scary, but it's exciting, isn't it? I guess it depends what
Yeah.
It's exciting in the academy, isn't it? Definitely, but as as people, it can be a little bit
I
scary, I
think
guess, can't it?
what especially about the pottery, the sort of high-tech imagery around pottery, and also kind of experimental archaeology where they're asking potters how they would have made something, then I think what I found interesting about that is that actually we really don't know everything yet. And that sounds like almost a platitude, but to be constantly faced with not just how little I know, but how little we know as a society at large about the pots that are in our museums, like just actually constantly surprised me, because I think, well, the history of recorded music is obviously an utterly different timeline, and the same permanency of the mystery isn't present in those histories. There's usually somebody who knows something, who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, or there's something somewhere, and that it might be lost, but you maybe can find it. Whereas with a lot of the objects in the museums, which you feel like or are presented in a way that form a much more important part of our sort of history as humans, as people, as a society, actually, there's so much we don't know about them.
I think that carries for a lot of things. That's a message, I think, for a lot of different disciplines that we don't know all the answers yet. And even though I think we like to think we know a lot, but yeah, we don't scratch the surface, do we? I just want to ask you about this process of clay becoming, and I just like this idea that I like the way you write about that process of when you turn it into a vessel or what have you. But I also like the idea of what it becomes once it comes out of the oven or the kiln. It's something that changes the space. It alters the world. It doesn't alter our thinking, but it changes the way we interact with the world, how we use it. I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about what you do with clay, literally.
We're like active participants with the material, and the material, has its own character where it does want to do certain things, it doesn't want to do other things. And it might do what you want, and it might be an absolute disaster. And there's like so much jeopardy in doing pottery, and there's so many absolute disasters, that it's a bit like gardening, and it breeds in you that sort of, this might go wrong, or you have to deal with a total loss of all your hard work, and you have to kind of get yourself together and deal with that if you're going to carry on doing pottery. Underneath all that, like that day-to-day wrangling and the immediacy of it, and the sort of contact and the processes, there is what is fundamentally happening is something like very elemental and quite alchemical. So it's earth, and clay can remain as clay infinitely. It dries out, you wet it, it dries out, you wet it. So it can cycle between this earth and like watery liquid stage forever. And when we as humans subject it to enough heat, and that can be in so many different scenarios, you can put it in a bonfire and it'll turn to ceramic, or you can put it in like a super high-tech scientific kiln that controls the temperatures, you know, by degrees, you know, that's essentially fire. You know, bonfire firings like really highlight that. Then you've got this earthen thing where you've dried the water from it and then you put it in the fire, and that fire is then what locks it into a totally different timeline. So once it's turned to ceramic, yeah, if you don't drop it, it's going to last tens of thousands of years. So, and I was interested in the fact that, you know, that's very elemental sort of processes that are involved there, these changes. But I was also interested in the fact that in order to lock it into a different timeline that is not the sort of geological deep time, in order to bring it into a slightly more understandable timeline of like 10 to 20,000 years or something like that, it's human intervention, and human intervention at the level of fire, which is, you know, the invention of fire is what we talk about as the thing that was the first moment we became human, you know. And so that's going on every time you're just making a terrible crap mug in the studio that may or may not survive, or that you hate, or that you're going to have to give to your mum because you can't stand it in a house.
Is that different to the other arts? Is that different to, you know, music, for instance? No, obviously in terms of, yeah, practically, obviously you don't stick a banjo in the kiln and it becomes music. But you know what I mean?
Stick a banjo in the kiln. I guess I did kind of have a think about this, like, what else? Is there anything that you can handle like this? That sort of cycling of the material between earth and water, the possibility of that as like infinite, pretty much infinite, is the thing that makes it so compelling to then fix it. You know, you think about, okay, yeah, that is an infinite cycling of this clay. I can just dump it in a bucket and use it again. So is this object that I've made, should I fire it? Because there's an environmental factor in that, actually. Like, if you fire it, it's fixed, so you better use it, because the kiln takes a lot of energy. I guess I'm interested in it in less in a practical way and more in the sense of the kind of imagination, or in a conceptual way, should I say? Yeah, in a conceptual way. Like, so we think about what it means to fire something, and then actually like kind of you can build in an idea of like your relationship to the earth through that firing in various ways.
Yeah, and it just is, it's this process of where you put something into something, and I guess you don't know what it's going to look like when it comes out. And I guess when we're writing and you have you well, I don't know if you do, maybe you don't. This is a bigger debate, but do you know what your writing looks like? I guess you have an idea of what you want to style it as, but it's just this thought of this object going into something and coming out the other side, and
Yeah,
you don't know how it's going to turn out. And maybe it seems just quite unique in that respect.
yeah, and I think writing and pottery is a bit similar in the sense that the better you get at it, the better idea you have of what's going to come out. Maybe.
Okay.
So like the more expert potter you are, you know, the more control you're going to have over your glazes and things like that. And there's always mishaps, like something will misfire, something will go runny, I don't know, and your pot stuck to the bottom. I guess that's any of these things can be analogies for writing. Like you can't get this one out of the kiln. This one's still half baked, you know. Yeah. And I guess yeah. So there's always useful analogies in any sort of notions of craft or making that are useful for writers, I think.
Well, you have. It's come out of the fire, and it's this lovely object. You know, it's a book, and it's a thing that we can hold as well. So, Jennifer, Lucy Allan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about clay, a human history. The book is out the 25th of July. But for now, Jennifer, thank you very much for being on the Rippling Pages.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.